SEEA. Welcome everybody to our first and only pre-conference webinar and a kickoff of the SEEA and AESP 2017 annual conference that will be next week here in Atlanta from October 16th to the 18th. The webinar today is the role of the trade ally in the Southeast energy efficiency agenda. And before I kick it over to our speakers, Karen Germain and Louisa Freeman with DNV GL, I just have a little bit of background information about SEEA and some information about some upcoming events. So as you all probably know, SEEA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to promote energy efficiency in the Southeast through our three work areas, which are the built environment, energy efficiency financing, and state and local utility policy. We're one of 6 regional energy efficiency organizations in the United States, and our region includes the 11 states in the Southeast that you can see on the map here. So this webinar is part of our SEEA webinar series. So I just wanted to let you know about another webinar that we have coming up on Thursday, November 16th. We will be bringing in the National Efficiency Screening Project to discuss the National Standard Practice Manual that was released earlier this year, and to talk about the new framework that it sets out for cost effectiveness testing. And you can register for that webinar by visiting the events page of our website at www.sealliance.org, and we hope that you will join us for that. Very quickly, just a couple of logistics for the webinar today. First, we ask that you please keep your microphone muted during the discussion to minimize any interference on the line. Also, we have reserved time after the presentation for question and answers. So as you have questions, if you could just submit those through the questions panel that you should see on your GoToWebinar control panel. And again, we'll have time after the main presentation for the speakers to answer your questions. So I'll be kind of brief with my introductions to make sure we have plenty of time for the presentation and for questions. But our main speaker today is Karen Germain, who's Business Direction Principal with Program Development and Implementation for DNV GL Energy Services. Karen will also be joined by her colleague, Louisa Freeman, who's Senior Principal Consultant at DNV GL, and she will be helping to coordinate the question and answer session of the webinar today. So with that, I will hand it over to Karen.
Great, and thank you, Kate. I also want to say thanks to SEEA for this opportunity to kick off the conference. It's exciting, and I appreciate the opportunity. So I want to continue the introductions ever so slightly and talk a little bit about DNV. I work within DNV GL Energy, in particular sustainable energy use, and my focus is around outreach and the trade allies. And in terms of DNV here in the U.S., we have a focus on policy and research, industrial energy management, sustainable buildings and communities, as well as the program implementation. And to give you a little bit of context, at least on the policy and research and the implementation, these pins in the map give a representation of where we're currently operating in the U.S. So the blue pins are program implementation, and the green are around policy and research projects. So what I wanted to do a little bit here today was talk about trade allies, some of the insights that we've been gathering in our work, and talk a little bit about what the future holds for the trade allies. And as Kate mentioned, I'll take some questions, or Louisa and I will take some questions at the end. So DNV GL invests 5% of their revenue each year in research, and these insights and the research that I've done are a part of that 5%. And what we've been doing is we've been surveying trade allies operating in the U.S. in the various implementation programs to try and gain some insight on what they think about the programs, how they operate as businesses, and really what their experience is in terms of operating and delivering on your behalf. So a quick snapshot of those trade allies. So in terms of the programs, what we see is that about 75% of the projects delivered within programs are attributable to the trade allies and their participation in your programs. And in terms of the type of programs we were really surveying, these typically tended to be mature programs as opposed to youthful or startup. And I think it's safe to say that the anchors of the programs tend to be the commercial work, as you can see here. So we're looking at 29% and 28% respectively in terms of small and large commercial customers that they're engaging with. And then it moves on to the industrial and the government. So this is, I think, pretty strong, both in terms of when we analyze programs individually, but also when we study them on the whole. In terms of the trade allies themselves, self-identifying in this survey, they chose to say that they're contractors, engineering firms, architectural firms. I don't think any of this is really a surprise, but I think it's good to see that this is how they step up and they self-identify. I think also it's interesting that when we looked at the responses, these trade allies were operating in 40 out of the 50 states. And they range typically from a small firm, so 1 to 3 employees in size, to well over 100. And 93% of those were coming from unique firms. But most interestingly, or so I think, is that 5% of them work across multiple territories. And I find that quite interesting because I think it talks to their ability to move about in the markets, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and their interest in moving about, but also the fact that when they're responding to the survey, there's a portion of them that are looking through it in terms of the multiplicity of the programs they're participating in. So that for me was a nice indicator. When we define the trade allies and their roles, we see them as educators. Obviously, there's sales, at least on their end, whether we refer to it as outreach or otherwise. They're facilitating a sale. They generate or raise awareness within the marketplace. And they are application completers, because we cannot, regardless of the initiative that we're executing within a program, deny the fact that either they as the filer or in support of their customers are completing those applications. And of course, there's quality and expediency issues that we're all interested in terms of the application. And then they execute community engagement. So we feel that they fulfill a number of different roles. It's not a singular role. And that's important to note when we start to consider what they're doing on behalf of the programs and how they're interacting with the community. Now, this slide, we start off on the left there talking about the most common types of projects. And I don't think that 68% is going to be a surprise to anybody participating in the webinar today. That's the reality that we all live and breathe. We know that we are constantly trying to balance out that portfolio and try to bring the lighting down and explore the other measures, get more applications. But nonetheless, I think it's always good to sanity check these things. And what I will say is that these numbers in terms of the last survey, we saw that lighting came down by about 2%. HVAC took an upward swing of about 5%. So that was interesting to see that movement. And I should also note that the solar PV here and the EMS were new to the survey. So we don't have any historic data on them, but it's important to note that they're new to the survey. Now, if you look to the right of the slide, of the trade allies surveyed, 71% say that they submit between 1 and 30 projects or applications on an annual basis to their programs, and that another 17% are looking at between 30 and 100, which is quite a sizable number of submissions. And then, of course, 12% are submitting 100 and above. So we thought that was interesting to sort of balance out the sheer volume in relation to the project focus of those that participated in the survey. Now, of that 68%, in terms of the project focus of the trade allies, again, not really surprising. That's what we know to be true in most of the programs, I think, across all of our experience. But what was really interesting here was that 34% of the trade allies survey stated that they work in technologies or measures that are not on the approved list for various programs. And they work with technologies that they'd like to see added to the approved measures list. And you say, well, okay, that's nice. You know, we all know they want more measures added, and we appreciate that. But why I find that particularly interesting is that tells me that as businesses, they're willing to invest in training and sales for technologies that are not approved. So in terms of the greater energy efficiency landscape, they see the opportunity, they believe in the opportunity, and they're willing to invest. So I personally find that quite exciting, and it gives me a lot of hope for where we're all trying to drive the market. Now, in terms of closing the sale, what we found is that nearly 2/3 of the contractors believe that reduced maintenance costs is the message or the issue that helps them close the deal. And that, you know, you can't really argue with the numbers when you look in the lower right part of the screen. We know this to be true both anecdotally and in terms of the research. I think that for me, this is important because it's so overwhelming. And then when we step back and we look at how we engage with the trade allies, how we expect them to engage with the market, it really resonates with our training agendas, how we're training them as trade allies, what we're training them in, both in the here and now and in the near-term future. The reduced maintenance cost is going to continue to be an issue. And that when we look at engagement overall with the community, with market influencers, with end customers, this is the one that gets their attention, that helps close the deal. In terms of the outreach and the trade ally sales staff, this is going to be where the bulk of the conversation and the coaching is taking place. And when we look at marketing campaigns, support materials, this is where they're ultimately saying that they need more support. Because if we take it in the context of this is how they undeniably say the deal is getting closed, this is where our focus needs to be when we look at the training, when we look at the marketing. And whether or not we're doing that on a broad landscape, or whether we're choosing to segment that based on verticals to fine-tune the messaging, that comes down to the program and the strategy you're executing. But the fact that closing the sale is really about the maintenance, the reducing of maintenance costs. I don't think we can really deny that. What we saw in terms of the conversation around barriers, this question really sort of focused on asking the participant to rank. So we asked them to rank, and these three came out as moderate or higher in terms of barriers in their experience. 67% coming in saying that the customers really don't truly understand the value of energy efficiency, and that 78% are saying customers have cash flow constraints and that they need financing. And finally, another 68% saying that the trade allies are finding it difficult to get in front of the right decision makers. Now, in terms of customers not understanding the value of energy efficiency, and of course, we were just saying that reduced maintenance cost is the deal closer. To me, this says that education and awareness continues to be an issue. I think we know that from a behavioral standpoint, that's never going to go away. And as we move past the low-hanging fruit, we have to refine our messaging. We have to be more persistent, more consistent in trying to drive the message out into the market. So in terms of education and training programs, both for the trade allies and I would say for the customers as well, we've got to continue really pressing forward with this. In terms of cash flow constraints and financing, well, I think there's various opportunities out there, and we're all exploring them. But that comes down to a matter of appetite for the individual utility and what they feel is right to offer or not offer. So I'll park that one right there. In terms of trade allies at 68% saying they find it difficult to get in front of the right decision maker, what I'd say here is that this is tried and true, regardless of what industry you work in, regardless of what niche within an industry you work in. This is the challenge for all of us. Who's the decision maker? Who's the influencer? And it isn't necessarily something that can be resolved, but rather supported. And I think, again, it sort of returns to the theme of persistence and consistence, and the trade allies knowing their own markets and investing the time in finding the targets and finding the correct person within the end customer. But not really any big surprises here, but it's also good to see that from a business perspective, they're running into what we would, and that there aren't any shocking outliers. So benefits. When we ask them what they value in what you're offering through your program, 40% of them rated updates on program news and changes, training on the program as well as the application, and access to your outreach staff as very useful. So the three key issues for them as trade allies were access to your trade allies, updates on your program news, keep that communication flowing, and the training on how to be in step with the program and making sure they're up to date with things. And I don't think any one of those is a small issue. And what it tells me is that from the terms of access to outreach professionals and training, they really do rely on the program staff to help them deliver the sale, to help them be on top of your needs and your program rules, and that fundamentally outreach is such a mainstay for them in being able to deliver. And not always, but quite often, the training we're all delivering, we're incorporating the outreach professionals. We may bring in some outsiders, but really you can see how that access is so important to them. And not to undermine the issue of the marketing collateral or the listings that some of you use on your program sites, but very useful, 40% rated very useful on the other three. Now, when we dug a little deeper on those numbers, 62% of the trade allies said that they meet with your outreach staff. And another 39% said they meet quarterly, and meeting quarterly is their preference, that they found that to be most beneficial. So again, the outreach staff providing a lot of good value to the program and to the trade allies. So what the future holds. The DNV GL has recently published the Energy Transition Outlook. And as a matter of fact, it was published last month. And it's a global and regional forecast of the energy transition looking outwards to 2050. And over the next 3 decades, the world's energy system is going to decarbonize, and we're going to see a lot of changes. And the Energy Transition Outlook is a strategy document, and it lays out some key milestones going out to 2050. And on the screen here, I've shared a few of those with you. So I'm going to let you digest those for a second, because I think they're going to weave quite substantially into the conversation around the future of the trade allies and what services they'll be providing. So in terms of road transport. We're saying that the world is going to continue to promote zero-emission vehicles, particularly in cities, and that there is already and there will continue to be a tremendous amount of work in terms of public procurement policies and government facilitating that growth. And urban planning policies as well will continue in terms of supporting sustainability and energy efficiency with considerable work around road transport. And we're seeing this now, we're feeling this now, and we will continue to see the urbanization where there's the draw to the city from the rural communities. So we expect to see those urban hubs continue to grow. And simultaneous to that, we're going to see growth in car dealers, car ownership. Now, when we step back and we look at that, I think there's a number of different players. It is obviously the communities and the government. You can see from that there's the footprint of the auto manufacturers. To give you a flavor on the auto manufacturers, we have major commitments, just as a light touch, from General Motors, Ford, Volkswagen. Obviously, we're all familiar with Tesla and the work that they've been doing. And Volvo has made some particularly strong commitments, so that they're saying by 2019 that they'll be partially or completely battery powered in terms of their production volume. So we're looking at some really big commitments from these manufacturers and where they're trying to take their companies. And then if we start to transition ever so slightly to the urban planning, a lot of good conversations with cities around their own strategies, their own energy efficiency strategies, their own sustainability strategies, and laying out roadmaps and where they plan to go. So they have their own agenda. And I think, for me, an interesting intersection of the two actually comes from Volkswagen, who has established VW Electrify America and Green Cities. And in doing so, they've committed to investing $2 billion over the course of 10 years in zero-emission vehicle infrastructure. So this is not the actual vehicles. They're not talking about their production volume. They're actually talking about the infrastructure. So for me, that's an interesting indicator that where we're going as a society, everyone's seeing a different opportunity and a different role for themselves. And in some cases, they're stepping outside their box because they see additional opportunity or necessity to facilitate their objectives. So on a practical level, what does that mean? Well, in terms of digitalization, it's here, it's upon us, it's upon our customers. That means we have greater transparency of their behavior, and it enables our ability to communicate with them, to lay out a plan for how we want to engage and where we want to go in our relationship with them. And we have tremendous opportunity in terms of the data we have based on their energy consumption. So I find that really exciting, where we're going to be able to go, where we're already going. The utilities, they're going to continue in their role, and I think it's very clear they're setting out their strategies. We need to be listening. There are nuances to those strategies, but they will continue to have a role in all this. The communities, we see them more and more taking ownership, creating their own strategies, laying out their own roadmaps, both in terms of energy and sustainability. They are increasingly becoming more sophisticated, and I mean that in a respectful way, in terms of how they want to tackle it, where they see themselves going, and understanding the nuances that this is an agenda on multiple fronts. And finally, the electrification is going to impact our community no matter where we live and work. And this means the residential, the commercial, and in particular, I'll say the retail. And by that, I mean, what does the future look like for a gas station? If the market's going to electrify, what will their business model look like down the road? What will the infrastructure model look like? And there's a lot of work being done there, but I think there's still a lot left to explore, and there's not necessarily definitive answers. So it's going to be really interesting to see what lays before us and how we arrive there. So in terms of the future in the trade ally, for me, they're hungry for growth. They really are. And, you know, earlier on when I was showing you some of the slides, and I said that 68% said that they were likely or very likely to be expanding into neighboring territory, or excuse me, what we're saying here is that they're very likely to do that. That tells me that they're not just satisfied with staying in their own territory, and that they know the sustainability for their business of relying on a single territory is challenging. And when we talk about the 34% that are willing to invest in technologies, to train their staff, to buy the equipment, to move into new measures that are not on your approved program list, that too demonstrates a hunger and a willingness to grow. I think that as we move into this electrification, they're going to be challenged to step outside of their boxes. More of them will be. Those that are hungry enough to be willing to move about are going to be comfortable with that. But those that have yet to do that are going to be doubly challenged to decide whether they're going to stay in a single market and maybe one or two services, or whether they're going to push their boundaries out. So the definition of a trade ally. For me, it's going to expand. Yep, we're going to have the contractors, we're going to have the ESCOs, the engineering firms. Those will continue. But why I say I think it's going to expand is because I don't think that they're going to be allowed to stand at simply doing one or two services or one or two types of technologies and measures. They will definitely have to expand. They will need to begin to think in terms of full solutions. What's the solution they're offering to their customers? And it is unlikely to stop at just the technologies and the measures. They're going to have to look at what other services should be included in their solutions. And by that, I mean, it's a growth opportunity. They're going to have to look at whether training and education of their customer is going to be part of their solution offering as our measures and our electrification existence becomes more sophisticated and the interconnectivity of those solutions intensifies. They're going to have to educate their customers, both the commercial and residential. And if they want to be competitive, if they want to offer a full solution, education is going to have to be a big part of that. Now, I mentioned that I think that the definition, the players are going to stay the same. I do think that. I think that the trade allies, I think the engineering firms, they'll continue to be players. But do I think that will expand a little bit to other firms? I do. I do think that there's going to be other players in that space. Who they're going to be remains a bit cloudy because I think that it's a bit too soon. But I don't see that it can only ever be what we see as a traditional trade ally. So the energy efficiency stakeholders, the utilities, it's going to stay. They're going to continue to be an active part of this. They are, after all, at the heart of all this. I see increasingly that government, in some form or fashion, will play a role. Is that government on a larger or a local level? I think it's going to be a combination. I think the communities increasingly are going to set out their own agendas. They're already looking to the utilities in the conversations I have to understand what they're doing and with their own agendas and what that means for the communities. And they're not satisfied to just sit back. So I think that the stakeholders we're going to have a mix. In the middle of that mix is going to be the trade ally, and the trade ally is going to be forced to perhaps deal with not just utility-backed programs, but perhaps community or government-backed programs, Will those be joint programs? Will they be individual programs? It's a bit too soon to say. Will there be other participants? Again, a little too soon to say. I think part of what we're going to see here is the convergence of strategies over a period of time, and the trade allies will have to work at having relationships, or at least keeping an eye on what the various stakeholders are doing, and be ready to react to that. I think that there's varying motivations in terms of the stakeholders. Certainly, there's economic development, there's infrastructure, there's always going to be an element of social inclusion and education, but never underestimate job creation, or for that matter, good old-fashioned capitalism. So I think there's a lot of motivators at play with the stakeholders, and they are not, look for them to be driving multiple agendas in terms of those motivations. But fundamentally, I think that for the trade ally community, the future's fairly bright. The programs will continue. The players, I think, are going to change. And from a trade ally perspective, they're going to need to diversify who they're engaging with. But the need for their services are going to remain, and they're going to but yes, a changing outlook in terms of the overall landscape of stakeholders. So in the course of the presentation here, I've been referencing the energy transition outlook. So if you want to explore that a bit more, you can find that on the DNV GL website. It's downloadable. And the most recent version of the Trade Ally Survey that I've been referencing was published in 2017. So that is also available if you want to take a look at the full results, because we explored a lot more issues. I just touched on a few of them today. And the next edition of the survey is going to be published in February of 2018. So we've been hard at work on that recently, and we're currently crunching the data to see what insights there are. But that is scheduled for February 2018. I want to say a big thank you to SEEA for this opportunity. It's been good fun. It's interesting. I always like talking about these subjects. So thank you to everybody, all of our colleagues over at SEEA. And also as a reminder that the 16th to the 18th, the conference in Atlanta. So thank you for letting me kick off the conference with this webinar. And I think now we'll go to some questions.
So Karen, this is Louisa. Thank you very much. And I want to reiterate our thanks as DNV GL to SEEA for giving us this opportunity. And as along with SEEA and as a board member of AESP Southeast, we're really looking forward to next week. We will have copies of Karen's report as well as the Energy Transition Outlook at our table. So I encourage people to come by and just talk with us about the research. I wanted to reinforce a couple of thoughts for the Southeast region in particular, and that's that we've also done some research on mid-sized cities and do see quite a bit of kind of technology leapfrogging, if you will, with the infrastructure developments. There's some federal money in that space. And there's big opportunities that we're seeing for utilities to partner with cities to achieve not only energy efficiency, but also electrification goals, and generally be involved in helping cities, because the utilities continue to retain the technical expertise that cities don't have, to understand the technologies and understand how they can be integrated into the grid, into the cities, in a way that they can succeed for the citizens. So that's a big trend we're also seeing, and certainly trade allies will be part of it. And the other thing that Karen mentioned that I think is salient to the Southeast region is, to the extent that revenues are kind of flat, or per capita consumption is somewhat down, we do see shifts away from rebates towards more education. But you can see from the research that Karen shared that trade allies really depend on utility programs to help them keep current on information, techniques, marketing and sales, but also technology information. You can think of how fast technology keeps changing. Utilities can still play a really significant role in helping trade allies in that area. And I think that's particularly salient for those utilities that are looking to kind of back off. It's happening, it's really a national trend, shifting away from incentives towards education.
Louisa, if I can jump in and
Yep.
support what you're saying, I think you raised an excellent point, because one of the things that I'm really hearing when I'm talking to utilities, when they start to talk about that point at which they see themselves beginning to back off, they are conscious of the fact that the trade allies have been integral to their ability to deliver against their targets, and that in order to develop those networks, they've invested heavily in the training of those trade allies. So they're conscious that in order to maintain that level of engagement with the end customer, there's going to have to be a balance of how do you continue to support and educate them while at the same time backing off. And I think they're conscious of that. How that is exactly executed will remain to be seen, but we're hearing that considerably.
Yeah, and I think your results are encouraging from the national survey as to how important that ongoing educational relationship is, even more so than incentives. So that's encouraging.
Yeah.
I'm going to kick out the first question and then turn it back over to the organizers. But who do you think is going to be funding energy efficiency programs in the future, Karen? Is there some evidence from the research or from the conversations that you've been having with utilities about that?
Yeah, not from the research, but from the anecdotal conversations I've been having. I think that we're going to continue for a while with utilities, but we will see the emergence of local communities of government funding. How that exactly plays out in terms of, will there be joint collaborations in certain areas? Will there be super funds coming from a utility? I think it's far too soon, but I think that we will be beginning to see a variety of funders in the markets as one backs off, another steps up to take the opportunity to take control of the reins of the future of what energy efficiency and the markets looks like.
Let me toss this to the organizers, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions if there aren't others. So I'm not seeing what other questions came in. How about you, SEEA? Do you have some questions to pose?
So we have not had any questions yet. This is just a reminder. If you have any questions, you can submit them through the questions section on your control panel. So please do that in the next few minutes if you have any questions.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to a couple questions we have here. What were the 3 key insights you got from the survey?
Yeah, so I think for me, the 3 key insights were the trade allies are willing to invest in green technology, whether or not that particular technology is on an approved list. And for me, that was fascinating because it shows me that they understand the opportunity. It shows me that when they are speccing a program, that they are going beyond those approved measures. Now, those might be additional measures that help complete a system. And so therefore they're almost necessary, but that's me second guessing it because we don't have quite that clarity. But I think that's particularly interesting. They're hungry. They're willing to invest in energy efficiency, regardless of whether or not it's approved, and that at the end of the day, they are closing the deals regardless. So I found that very interesting. I think the second thing was that the training that's provided, that they value it. They recognize the value. It is not a throwaway. They truly value it. Now, in my anecdotal conversations with trade allies, I've been meeting recently with national and regional trade allies and exploring a lot of themes around growth, partnering, value, and what I got back was that the training is important. They know it's important, and they appreciate it. And in terms of its connection to their ability to grow their business, they know that that training is helping to keep their employees current with whatever measures you're rolling out. It helps keep them current in terms of headcount and turnover. Now, it may not sound like a lot, because I think we're also used to dealing in the space of training, and oh yeah, we have to provide it. But the overwhelming response was that they value it. And I think probably the third thing I got out of it was, just like any other business, the access to key decision makers continues to be a challenge for them. And while I don't think that that's necessarily for the utilities to resolve, it was reassuring and informative, because it says that they are operating just as well as any other business and facing the same challenges. So rather than getting a barrier that was an outlier, or a barrier that we should have all seen and been able to address, this was par for the course. So that was solidly reassuring. So for me, yeah, the three issues were really around their willingness to invest to grow, that the training being provided by the utilities is highly valued, not marginalized, and that they are facing the same fundamental challenges we would expect them to, that any business faces.
And what kinds of training, do you have more insight onto what kinds of training were more effective, since it looks like some utilities are going to be investing more on that dimension of value versus in the incentive side?
Yeah. This is anecdotal based on the work I've been doing and the conversations I've been having, but the feedback is that those annual kickoff meetings, those annual rollout meetings are highly valued. They know that's where the utility is setting the table for the year, and that if they're not there, they're behind the curve. So those are valued, those are appreciated in terms of the detail that is gotten into. How granular we get in those meetings is appreciated. And I think too, in terms of anecdotal, whenever I go to them, whenever I see that a trade ally hasn't sent just one person, but they've sent two, they've sent three, and they are entrenched in those seats and they are taking it all down word for word, tells me that they take it seriously. So I think that those kickoffs should never be underrated. They're definitely valued by the trade ally. Beyond that, what we're hearing is that business training, in other words, sales training, highly valued. How do you make the business case for energy efficiency? How do you make the business case for a particular measure or system? As we get more involved and we move beyond the low-hanging fruit, the people who are going to make the purchases relatively easily, it's going to become a harder conversation, and they need help structuring the message, structuring the pitch, and they value that. I see a need for that in terms of the vertical and how much we're drilling down on those verticals, and even at times intersecting that with certain technologies or certain measures, depending on the size of the opportunity in your market. So I think that there's a lot there around helping them to develop their business acumen. And if we step back for a second in terms of that business training, let's not forget that if you're looking at, in the near to midterm, of starting to pull back from the market with incentives, you've still got to make sure that you, and by proxy your trade allies, are still highly engaged and valued by the end customer. So their ability to make a good sale, a savvy sale, a very detailed sale, becomes more important. So to your point before, Louisa, pulling back on the incentives, pushing up on the training, and particularly around the sales. Now that said, training, technical training continues to be hot, because of course the people that are really in the field on behalf of the trained allies are fundamentally technically oriented people. And we've got to make sure that they stay current on the new measures being added, or for that matter, you've got an issue around, as does any business, turnover. So helping them to make sure that their teams are up to speed, even with the fundamentals. So it isn't the technical training isn't necessarily about the latest and the greatest only. You're still going to have to keep a watchful eye on taking care of the fundamentals for the technologies.
SEEA, any new questions coming in, or?
No, still no other.
Okay.
Oh, actually, we just have one come in. 1 second.
Well, while she's looking at that, I'm going to ask you, is there something, anything much changing for the new questionnaire? Are there some new topics that you're touching on for 2018, or pretty much doing a refresh?
So, no, it's a good question. I'm happy to answer it. So what we are doing for the new survey is we will continue to ask what I refer to as foundational questions. So a selection of questions that we will track year on year, many of which I touched on today, but also a few others. And then each year we're going to be exploring a trending topic. So an issue that is developing in energy efficiency. And that way we're going to be visiting sort of what I see as indicator questions, foundational questions to help us understand the market and how it's behaving and what our trade allies are thinking and doing. And at the same time, we're going to test their interest, their knowledge, their thoughts on these trending topics. So I'm kind of excited about that, and really looking forward to seeing the outcome of the data we've gathered.
Right. So here, the first question is, don't rebates and their impact on reducing kilowatt hour needs both take away from the utility's bottom line? So in that case, what are the utilities' justifications, since it seems like trade allies help accelerate reducing their revenue?
Yeah, so I guess I personally don't see this as an issue around reducing the revenue. I think this is about market stimulation and acceleration. And of course, every market's slightly different, so trying to delve into that on a broad sweeping landscape is a bit tricky, but for me, it's about market stimulation. I guess fundamentally that's how I see what we do, and ultimately the customer satisfaction, the positive customer satisfaction that's stimulated out of the investment in the programs, in the incentives, has a solid payback for the utilities. So for me, this is about market stimulation and market growth. And that's sort of how I see what the agenda that we're pursuing. I don't know, Louisa, that's my personal view. So I'll let you respond. I think she's on mute.
I'm sorry about that. So yeah, we're seeing trends where utilities that have been experiencing, not just revenue loss from energy efficiency, but just revenue loss because of, the success of standards and labeling and all kinds of other, naturally occurring energy efficiency is a bigger chunk of what we're seeing. And so, there are some cost efficiency questions being raised not just by utilities but also by regulators in the Southeast region and in the Midwest in particular, and elsewhere that are questioning, what are we investing in here? But to Karen's point, and other utilities are looking for what are the additional value propositions for energy efficiency as well as beneficial electrification. So beneficial new loads, energy efficient new loads to help balance the system load factor and keep rates low for all ratepayers. So to the extent that there's some strategic things like electric vehicles, the development of EV infrastructure helps build off-peak load, and that these are good things for the system. So kind of using energy efficiency as a strategic tool within the distributed energy resource platform, customer side of the meter activity is still going to be really important. It's what we're seeing is it's going to be more geographically targeted and temporal in terms of where in the service territory is it needed, and how can we use or deploy programs and measures and trade ally engagement to help us build this resource where we need it and when we need it over the time of the day. So we're seeing utilities be much more strategic about energy efficiency opportunities. And then the revenue part of it is, it's like society seems to be moving in this direction. There's segments of the market where you can't find an inefficient, a piece of equipment anymore, because so much of equipment is efficient. So whereas we don't need to incentivize it, it's still going to be happening. So utilities are going to have to deal with, do we look for additional loads of that efficient equipment, or do we look at the economic development value? So we're doing a lot more work in capturing the other benefits of these measures, whereas energy efficiency is less maybe of a concern or a focus. In some cases, we're looking at, what are some other metrics that we're going to need to keep an eye on? That's the value. So I think that's where we're on the research side, we're seeing some consistency with the Trade Ally survey here, is that utilities are still going to be playing a fundamental role, even if there's some revenue questions as well. You still want to be a source, and utilities still are a source of technical information. So they're still looked to for technology adoption support. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
I think that's great. Louisa, do you have any final questions?
No, I think we're good. If there's anything else, but we really appreciate people's attention and look forward to meeting people face to face next week in Atlanta and having more information available on the kinds of research that we've been doing at DNV GL. So thank you. Thanks, Karen.
Absolutely. Yes, and thanks to both of you guys. I think that conversation really sets up a lot of really good context and background for a lot of the conversations that we'll be having next week at the conference. So with that brings us to the end of our webinar today. Thanks again to Karen and Louisa. For those of you who are joining us here in Atlanta next week, I encourage you to join us for our in-person session on trade ally models that's currently scheduled for Tuesday, October 17th from 1:45 to 2:45 p.m. And there will be more information about that available both on our website and the agenda there, but also in an upcoming email blast for conference attendees. Also, this webinar will be made available on our website, so both a recording of the presentation and all of the slides. And otherwise, we hope to welcome many of you to Atlanta for our conference next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.